Hello friends, welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex, and welcome back for another book recommendation. I know it's been a while. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I essentially recommend some of my favorite books. It's not a review, it's a recommendation. I talk a little bit about every book, and I also read a little bit out of every book, because I think that getting to hear a little bit of the language of a book can, tempt you or dissuade you to read the book. I think books are a great inspiration to my miniature painting work and all things in the hobby, the terrain building and the dioramas and everything. I get snippets of stories and things like that through books that I think is very inspiring and helped me come up with color schemes and things like that. That's why I want and like to also talk about books on this miniature painting channel. We're going to have a bit of a theme today. I have not done themes before. It's a matter of religion or belief. And we've got 3 books. We're actually going to start with the first one here, which is Terry Pratchett, Small Gods. I've read all of Terry Pratchett books, I believe, several of them more than once. Several of them more than twice, and probably several of them more than 3 or 4 times. I very much like Terry Pratchett, and so I could easily recommend you all of his books. But I did get a question at some point of, what's your favorite Terry Pratchett book? And that's an impossible sort of question to answer, but this is one of my favorites, Small Gods. This is a Discworld novel. For those of you that don't know about Terry Pratchett, I'm sure you do, but if you don't, he's written a lot of books, and most of them take place on a fantasy world called the Discworld. The Discworld is in fact a big tortoise, and there's 4 elephants on a tortoise, and on the 4 elephants there's a disc, and that's the disc world. It travels through space, and it's filled with all kinds of interesting things. There's witches, and there's wizards, and there's but one of the more brilliant things about, I think, for me personally, about Terry Pratchett's writing is that it's in fact not so much about wizards, it's about humans and about us, just translated and made even more funny and absurd through whatever takes place on the Discworld. This book centers around a theory that Terry Pratchett has on the Discworld, which is that if you believe in something or like a god, then it actually exists. And the more people that believe in a god, the more powerful that god becomes. And so there's plenty of small gods, local gods, where people, believe in some little gnome that rescues your sheep when it falls off a cliff, and all of a sudden, there's a little gnome running around because people start to believe in it, and so on and so forth. And if enough people do it, then all of a sudden it turns into this massive god. Small Gods is actually about when one of those massive gods, because of, I guess what can happen with religion sometimes is that you actually stop believing in the actual God and only believe in the religion itself. And so the God actually doesn't really have any believers anymore, and is no longer the big powerful God, and is instead, wakes up one day as a little tortoise. And so this entire book discusses the things like belief and religion in a fun way, because it's Terry Pratchett, and I like it because it's great writing. It also feels a little bit outside of some of the more established things that Terry Pratchett has going on the Discworld. There's, specific cities or stories of people that are sort of reoccurring, and this one feels a little bit outside of that, and therefore it's a nice recommendation as a sort of standalone book. Like if you want to read something of Terry Pratchett's that to me is very Terry Pratchett, then I think this is a very nice book. I'm gonna read a little bit just from the beginning, which won't really tell you much of the actual story. There's Terry Pratchett, by the way. Unfortunately, he has since passed away, which is sad because I wish to read more of his books, but I can't because he can't write them. Anyway, I'm going to read a passage that isn't actually telling you all that much about the major story, but it's a great example of just the language and Terry Pratchett's constant wit and great storytelling. The story takes place in desert lands, in shades of umber and orange. When it begins and ends is more problematical, but at least one of its beginnings took place above the snow line, thousands of miles away, in the mountains around the hub. One of the recurring philosophical questions is, does a falling tree in the forest make a sound when there is no one to hear? Which says something about the nature of philosophers, because there is always someone in a forest. It may only be a badger wondering what that cracking noise was, or a squirrel a bit puzzled by all the scenery going upwards, but someone. At the very least, if it was deep enough in the forest, millions of small gods would have heard it. Things just happen, one after another. They don't care who knows. But history is different. History has to be observed. Otherwise, it's not history. It's just, well, things happening one after another. And of course, it has to be controlled. Otherwise, it might turn into anything. Because history, contrary to popular theories, is kings and dates and battles. And these things have to happen at the right time. This is difficult. In a chaotic universe, there are too many things to go wrong. It's too easy for a general's horse to lose a shoe at the wrong time, or for someone to mishear an order, or for a carrier of the vital message to be waylaid by some men with sticks and a cash flow problem. Then there are wild stories, parasitic growths on the tree of history, trying to bend it their way. So history has its caretakers. They live, well, in the nature of things, they live wherever they are sent, but their spiritual home is in a hidden valley in the high ram tops of the Discworld, where the books of history are kept. These aren't books in which the events of the past are pinned like so many butterflies to a cork. These are the books from which history is derived. There are more than 20,000 of them. Each one is 10 feet high, bound in lead, and the letters are so small that they have to be read with a magnifying glass. When people say it's written here. There are fewer metaphors around than people think. Every month, the abbot and 2 senior monks go into the cave where the books are kept. It used to be the duty of the abbot alone, but 2 other reliable monks were included after the unfortunate case of the 59th abbot, who made $1 million in small bets before his fellow monks caught up with him. Besides, it's dangerous to go in alone. The sheer concentratedness of history, slithing past soundlessly out into the world, can be overwhelming. Time is a drug. Too much of it kills you. The 493rd abbot folded his wrinkled hands and addressed Luzi, one of his most senior monks. The clear air and untroubled life of the secret valley was such that all the monks were seniors. Besides, when you work with time every day, some of it tends to rub off. The place is Omnia, said the abbot, on the Klatchian coast. I remember, said Luzi. Young fellow called Ossory was there? Things must be carefully observed, said the abbot. There are pressures, free will, predestination, the power of symbols, turning point. You know all about this. Haven't been to Omnia for, must be 700 years, said Luzi. Dry place. Shouldn't think there's a ton of good soil in the whole country either. Off you go then, said the abbot. I shall take my mountains, said Luzi. The climate will be good for them. He also took his broom and his sleeping mat. The history monks don't go in for possessions. They find most things wear out in a century or 2. It took him 4 years to get to Omnia. He had to watch a couple of battles and an assassination on the way. Otherwise, they would just have been random events. Next book, which is probably as well a book that you've heard of, which is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? by Philip K. Dick. This is, as the book says, a science fiction masterwork. Most would probably recognize it because they've read that the film Blade Runner is based on the book, which it is, kind of. My recommendation for this book is several reasons. One is it's a great book. I really think it is. Philip K. Dick has written several books, and I'd say that this is a pretty good sort of entry point as well to his work. If you've seen the film Blade Runner, then when you read the book, you'll be like, oh, that was loosely based on the book. You know, it's actually very different. The story is sort of the same, but so much of what is maybe great with Blade Runner, which is, you know, the somber mood, the visuals, the story, like the visual storytelling, the music, the ambience, just, you know, it's just such a great movie, is not really something I recognize from this book. This book is maybe about other things, really. The storyline is basically the same, but yeah, it's just very different from the film, or let's say the film is just quite different from the book, and so it's kind of interesting that way. It's like, if you've seen the film, that doesn't mean you've read the book, so, you know, please go ahead and read the book. The story is basically, as in the film, it's about a police officer. What's his name? Rick Deckard. And well, he's not a police. He's sort of a bounty hunter that works for the police, and his job is to take down robots called replicants. It's a story about artificial intelligence and how humans react to artificial intelligence, and what artificial intelligence maybe could do with us, and everything in between. It takes place in a very surrealistic world, which is post-apocalyptic. There's been a great war. Most people have left the Earth, and a few remain, but they're sort of slowly dying in a nuclear wasteland. All great things based on, you know, stuff we like to read when it comes to sci-fi. It's also about belief, which is something that is very much not featured in the film. The people in the book sort of kind of worship a fellow called Mercer, I think. Anyway, that's why it ended up here, because it's very much about belief, and who believes in what, and why we believe in things, and you know, do androids dream of electric sheep? This again is to give you an idea of the type of language, and doesn't tell you so much about the coming story, but gives you a good setting. In a giant, empty, decaying building, which had once housed thousands, a single TV set hawked its wares to an uninhabited room. Their ownerless ruin had before World War terminus been tended and maintained. Here had been the suburbs of San Francisco. A short ride by monorail, rapid transit, the entire peninsula had chattered like a bird tree with life and opinions and complaints. And now the watchful owners had either died or migrated to a colony world, mostly the former. It had been a costly war, despite the valiant predictions of the Pentagon and its smug scientific vassal, the Rand Corporation, which had in fact existed not far from this spot. Like the apartment owners, the corporation had departed, evidently for good. No one missed it. In addition, no one today remembered why the war had come about, or who, if anyone, had won. The dust, which had contaminated most of the planet's surface, had originated in no country, and no one, even the wartime enemy, had planned on it. First, strangely, the owls had died. At the time it had seemed almost funny, the fat, fluffy white birds lying here and there, in yards and on streets. Coming out no earlier than twilight as they had, while alive, the owls escaped notice. Medieval plagues had manifested themselves in similar ways in forms of many dead rats. This plague, however, had descended from above. After the owls, of course, the other birds followed. But by then, the mystery had been grasped and understood. A meager colonization program had been underway before the war, but now that the sun had ceased to shine on Earth, the colonization entered an entirely new phase. In connection with this, a weapon of war, the synthetic freedom fighter had been modified, able to function on alien worlds. The humanoid robot, strictly speaking, the organic android, had become the mobile donkey engine of the colonized program. Under UN law, each emigrant automatically received possession of an android subtype of his choice, and by 1990, the variety of subtypes passed all understanding, in the manner of American automobiles from the 1960s. That had been the ultimate incentive of emigration, the android servant as carrot, the radioactive fallout as a stick. The UN had made it easy to emigrate, difficult if not impossible to stay. Loitering on Earth potentially meant finding oneself abruptly classified as biologically unacceptable, a menace to the pristine heredity of the race. Once pegged as special, a citizen, if even accepting sterilization, dropped out of history. He ceased, in effect, to be part of mankind. And yet, persons here and there declined to migrate. That, even to those involved, constituted a perplexing irrationality. Logically, every regular should have emigrated already. Perhaps, deformed as it was, Earth remained familiar, to be clung to. Or possibly, the non-emigrant imagined that the tent of dust would deplete itself finally. In any case, thousands of individuals remained, most of them constellated in urban areas where they could physically see one another, take heart at their mutual presence. Those appeared to be the relatively sane ones, and in dubious addition to them, occasional peculiar entities remained in the virtually abandoned suburbs. John Isidore, being jammed at by the television set in his living room as he shaved in the bathroom, was one of these. He simply had wandered to this spot in the early days following the war. In those evil times, no one had known, really, what they were doing. Populations detached by the war had roamed, squatted, temporarily at first, one region and then another. Back then, the fallout had been sporadic and highly variable. Some states had been nearly free of it, others became saturated. The displaced populations moved as the dust moved. The peninsula south of San Francisco had been at first dust-free, and a great body of persons had responded by taking up residence there. When the dust arrived, some had died and the rest departed. J.R. Isidore remained. I think one of the things I very much like about this book, apart from, all of it, it's a very, very interesting read, is it is still, as in the movie, about, this bounty hunter that's out to essentially kill a bunch of rogue androids. I realize now how much, both of what we read and things TV series we watch, the great focus on action, the gunfights and the sword fights and all of this, that had not really entered this story. At least it's like, it just happens. It's like, oh, there's an android, bang, let's go get the next one, and the stories are about more than the fights and the gunfights. Next up is Alastair Reynolds, Chasm City. This is the third book I read by Alastair Reynolds. He's a science fiction writer. One of the things he's known for, I guess, is about trying to be, I'm not going to say realistic, but that the way he describes, the science fiction setting, the technology and all of this could possibly be scientifically correct. If we only had that type of technology, then it would probably work this way. It's not like here's my lightsaber and we travel at light speed. Vroom. Let's not explain it any further. Which is kind of fun reading it, and in that sort of world, he's built up several stories, and so there's quite a few books that are a bit more like a series, pre-series, post-series, in the middle of series, And I figured this Chasm City is a book that one can read as a standalone, which is one of the reasons I'm recommending it. If you want to try reading Alastair Reynolds, this could be one of the books to read. It also sticks out because it fits with my belief and religious setting. It's essentially about a lot of things, really. There's parallel stories going, at least two major parallel stories of a person that was on a first, sort of colony ship going out into space, doing different things, and in a way later on almost became something of a god. And the other story is living in the same, is later than that in the world where this person is a god. And in a way it also touches some of the post-apocalyptic settings. Chasm City is in fact a sort of a post-apocalyptic setting. There's the city is fallen, so to speak. It's a bit of a disaster going, a lot of stuff going on. Sort of a lot more sort of modern writing than this past one, I guess. I like Alastair Reynolds. Okay. I'll read and then I'll talk more. Darkness was falling as Detailing and I arrived at the base of the bridge. There's one thing you need to know about Red Hand Vasquez, Detailing said. Don't ever call him that to his face. Why not? Because it pisses him off, and that's a problem. I brought our wheeler to a near halt and then parked it among some motley row of vehicles lining one side of the street. I dropped the stabilizers, the overheated turbine smelling like a hot gun barrel. It's not like we usually worry about feelings of lowlives, I said. No, this time it might be best to err on the side of caution. Vasquez may not be the brightest star in the criminal filament, but he's got friends and a nice little line in extreme sadism, so be on your best behavior. I'll give it my best shot. Yeah, and do your best not to leave too much blood on the floor in the process, will you? We got out of the wheeler, both of us craning our necks to take in the bridge. I'd never seen it before today. This was my first time in the demilitarized zone, let alone Nueva Valparaiso. And it had looked absurdly large even when we'd been 15 to 20 kilometers out of town. Swan had been sinking towards the horizon, bloated and red for the hot glint near its heart, but there had still been enough light to catch the bridge's thread and occasionally pick out the tiny ascending and descending beads of elevators riding in to and from space. Even then I wondered if we were too late, if Rivich had already made it aboard one of the elevators, but Vasquez had assured us that the man we were hunting was still in town, simplifying his web of assets on Sky's Edge and moving funds into long-term accounts. Detailing strolled around the back of our wheeler. With its overlapping armor segments, the mono-wheeled car looked like a rolled-up armadillo and popped open a tiny luggage compartment. Shit, almost forgot the coats, bro. Actually, I was sort of hoping you would. He threw me one. Put it on and stop complaining. I slipped on the coat, easing it over the layers of clothing I already wore. The coat hems skimmed the street puddles of muddy rainwater, but that was the way aristocrats liked to wear them, as if daring others to tread on their coat-tails. Detailing shrugged on his own coat and began tapping through the patterning options embossed around the sleeve, frowning in distaste at each sartorial offering. No, Christ, no again, and this won't do either. I reached over and thumbed one of the tabs. Here, you look stunning. Now shut up and pass me your gun. I'd already selected a shade of pearl for my own coat, a color which I hoped would provide a low-contrast background for the gun. Detailing retrieved the little weapon from a jacket pocket and offered it to me, just as if he was passing me a packet of cigarettes. The gun was tiny and semi-translucent, a haze of tiny components visible beneath its smooth, lucite surface. It was a clockwork gun. It was made completely out of carbon, diamond mostly, but with some fullerenes for lubrication and energy storage. There were no metals or explosives in it, no circuitry. Only intricate levers and ratchets, greased by fullerene spheres. It fired spin-stabilized diamond flechettes, drawing its power from the relaxation of fullerene springs coiled almost to breaking point. You wound it up with a key, like a clockwork mouse. There were no aiming devices, stabilizing systems, or target acquisition aids, none of which would matter. I've tried to have like 3 different type of books. Alastair Reynolds is, it feels like there's a lot of books to read. It can be, rather fast. I'm not going to say light, but, and it's sort of pretty serious. And there's a lot of good-looking people shooting at each other. Kind of, spaceships, travel, all of that. This is more sort of, classical style writing. It's heavy in a different way. This is like scientifically heavy. There's a lot of stuff going on, parallel stories and stuff like. This is more sort of heavy on maybe the intellect. Well, this is kind of heavy on the intellect anyway as well, but in a good way. It's heavy with wit and it's just so very sort of human. If you haven't read any of these 3 books, I would very much recommend them. I always kind of get the question of like, what are your favorite books? And so Terry Pratchett is a favorite author. That is one of my favorite books that he's written. But I do have a book that I, constantly keep coming back to, and it's not sort of strictly fantasy or science fiction, which is what the other recommendations sort of center around. It's called The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. We're now entering the realm of like classic writing, when people say this is one of the best books ever written, that kind of literature. Because it's Russian, it can be sometimes a bit complicated keeping track of who everyone is, because people have like lots of different type of names and all of this. The first time I read this book, it was a very long time ago. I probably had to go at it a few times. It's not as bad as like the Brothers Karamazov or something like that. But it's getting there. But this is like one of my favorite all-time books. Now, it's not actually fantasy. You could say it's a bit of mysticism, and it's very much on point with the religious theme of today. So I just wanted to throw it in there. Essentially, it's a story about when the devil comes to Moscow. It's a satire about Russia at the time. It wasn't published for ages because it, obviously wouldn't even pass the censors back then. It's a great book. I'm just going to read a fun little passage because it's really difficult. This is one of those books where it's like I can't pick one. You need to read the book. I can't just, that the devil actually is in Moscow. And what would actually happen, like a lot of the sort of science fiction and the fantasy and stuff, it's strange things happen, and it's just generally accepted that, oh, look, all of a sudden there's all this fantasy stuff going on. But what if it actually would happen, because no one would believe you, which is what happens here. It's like people conversate with the devil and he says these weird things. So they go to the police and say, I met this man, he said these weird things. And they say, you're obviously insane. We're going to put you in an asylum, which is kind of what would happen. And I just love that. Apart from just how this book is written, because it's the language. I wish I could read Russian, kind of, because obviously I have to read a translation. But anyway, here's a bit of a fun bit. This man, Fagor pointed at Begalski, is starting to bore me. He sticks his nose in everywhere without being asked and ruins the whole act. What should we do with him? Cut off his head, said a stern voice. What did you say, sir? Was Fagor's instant response to this savage proposal. Cut off his head? That's an idea. Behemoth, he shouted to the cat. Do your stuff. 1, 2, 3. Then the most incredible thing happened. The cat's fur stood on end and it uttered a harrowing meow. It crouched, then leaped like a panther straight for Bengalski's chest and from there to his head. Growling, the cat dug its claws into the compiere's glossy hat, and with a wild screech it twisted the head clean off the neck in 2 turns. 2,500 people screamed at once. Fountains of blood from the severed arteries in the neck spurted up and drenched the man's shirt front and tails. The headless body waved its legs stupidly and sat on the ground. Hysterical shrieks rang out through the auditorium. The cat handed the head to Fagot, who picked it up by the hair and showed it to the audience. The head moaned desperately. "Fetch a doctor." "Will you go on talking so much rubbish?" said Fagot threateningly to the weeping head. "No, I promise I won't," croaked the head. "For God's sake, stop torturing him!" A woman's voice from the box suddenly rang out above the turmoil, and the magician turned towards the sound. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, shall we forgive him?" asked Fagot, turning to the audience. "Yes, forgive him, forgive him." The cries came at first from a few individual voices, mostly women, then merged into a chorus with the men. "What is your command, monsieur?" Fagot asked the masked professor. "Well now," replied the magician reflectively, "they're people like any others. They're overfond of money, but then they always were. Humankind loves money, no matter if it's made of leather, paper, bronze, or gold. They're thoughtless, of course, but then they sometimes feel compassion too. They're ordinary people. In fact, they remind me very much of their predecessors, except that the housing shortage has soured them." And he shouted the order, "Put back the head." Taking careful aim, the cat popped the head back on its neck, where it sat as neatly as if head and body had never been parted. Most amazing of all, there was not even a scar on the neck. The cat wiped the tailcoat and shirt front with its paws, and every trace of blood vanished. Fagot lifted the seated Bengalski to his feet, shoved him a bundle of money into his coat pocket, and led him off stage. Bit of a bonus. It's it can be perceived as heavy reading. It's literature and all that. But one of my favorite books. I hope you enjoyed these recommendations. Thank you for watching. Please, recommend some books to me in the comments. It's always nice to get good new recommendations for books to read. A big thank you to my patrons, and please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.